Now we're recording the question period. So, look, firstly, I think you're a wonderful philosophical counselor, Alex. You just have not had any clients yet, but that's almost beside the point. I mean, what you presented shows me that you're a great philosophical counselor. My one piece of advice to you is when you have your client in the room, whether it's your first or your hundredth, throw all the models out the window. I mean, keep them dangling on a string. But throw your models out the window and just use your great skills to find out what kind of philosopher you're in the room with. Because by conducting an inquiry, your client is going to tell you what kind of philosopher she is, and very quickly, by your questioning, will identify herself in one of those four categories, or maybe impel you to add more. But in any case, just by dialoguing, you'll discover who you're in the room with and who the sleeping philosopher is who needs to be awakened. And that's another way of looking at what we do. Okay, that's one quick comment. I'm so happy you mentioned Gail Sheehy. Her work has been virtually forgotten here because attention spans are now 30 seconds or less. She wrote a huge bestseller in the 70s called Passages. And it was a guide primarily for young women. Psychologists have done all this work on adolescent psychology. And then everybody stopped because they assumed, as you've understood and commented, right, when we reach 20 or 21, we're deemed to be adults, and so we don't need any more guidance. Everyone's assumed. Big mistake. People need a roadmap for their 20s and their 30s and their 40s. So good that you mentioned her. I'd love to see more philosophers writing roadmaps for their 20s and 30s, as you really suggested. About your question to mindfulness, I can tell you from a Korean conference on this subject that I attended a couple of years ago, even well-practiced Buddhists are becoming irritated by the industry of mindfulness that's being created, bottled, and sold primarily by psychology. They've abstracted the seventh factor out of the Eightfold Path. They've treating it like they invented it, and people are getting sick and tired of hearing about it, but it's become a huge and very lucrative industry, which totally betrays, in my view, and I'm not alone, the tradition from which it beautifully emanates. So, I mean, that's some feedback from the US. I'm very dismayed, but not shocked, that Jung appears to have been cancelled in the UK. You'll have to tell us why later. We can hardly mention anybody's name. I just want to tell you that in the U.S., we have on camera, not many years ago on a video, we have Michelle Obama, the former First Lady, telling school children that Dr. Seuss will teach them everything they need to know about life. And now, a few short years later, Dr. Seuss has been canceled. I don't know why she hasn't been canceled, guilt through association, but I guess she's untouchable. So I think that it's really a sign of importance. If you make any significant contribution nowadays, you're going to be canceled. That's maybe how we can detect who we ought to be reading. You've made so many wonderful comments, and I just want to say two more things. First of all, that Scruton, knew nothing about our movement. You're alluding to a very old piece in the Times. I replied to him. I'm not sure if they published it. I'll send you the reply. It'll amuse you.
Please do. Thanks.
Because he knew nothing. Scruton is really good at tilting at windmills, He turns his polemic skills on topics he knows nothing about and excoriates things about which his ignorance is nearly complete. So I gave him a very big dose of his own medicine, which will amuse you no end, and I'll be happy to share it with you since you brought up his name. So I think this is a really great talk. Remember one difference between us and the psychotherapists, though. Our colleague Michael Russell, who is a wonderful philosophical counselor, but also is scarily a trained psychoanalyst, once characterized psychotherapy as the business in which the customer is always wrong. So he's going to challenge wearing the psychotherapy hat. He will challenge, or the psychoanalytic hat, they're different, but he'll challenge whatever is being said to him. I think we want to believe our clients in the first instance. We'd like to treat them as engaged inquirers and believe what they're telling us about their story. But in the back of your mind, be mindful that what they present is not always necessarily the real issue that they want to deal with. It's part of what Lydia said about self-deception and illusion, not the same thing, but people may have illusory notions about what's problematic, and it's our job to help identify them through inquiry. Okay? Wonderful talk. Can I please ask who would like to go first, or next rather, and welcome comments and questions and suggestions for Alex. Lydia, please. Unmute yourself.
Yes. Alex, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I would gladly be your first client if you will, beginning as I am my third half of life. So let me tell you something of my own experience as a human being, as a philosopher, mostly, and also as a philosophical practitioner, but mainly as a human being. There is something that I think is more basic than the first half of life problem than the second half life problem, that hopefully, and maybe we do it through teaching philosophy. And this is a question you may ask yourself: what's the difference between the many books that there are and private practice? Hopefully, we engage in search for values about the good life that embody traditions, different traditions, and our relation to them, our own voice, our own will, how much we can follow will in life, how much reality itself is not amenable to our own will. So we try to find out what we desire, what we want, how much it can be accessed or not, in trying to choose a profession and a partner. So we need some help in order to identify in advance the issues that may make the second half of life problem non-existent. If we manage to choose well, and here's where you can be helpful and try to see if these choices can accompany the person in his own perception of what the second half of life, a third half of life may be. Now, life is very long. It's absolutely normal that we change either partners or professions or views with time. But the initial looking at all these values and searching where you are among all these options should be done individually with everyone. And if it's done well, you may end up at least with one of the two that you don't regret, your profession or your partner, something like that, with a lot of adjustment. But if you want to prepare for that meeting, and Lou said, let the client tell you, but educate yourself. Why only Stoicism and Buddhism? I was astonished by that. You have Plato, you have Aristotle, you have Socrates before that, you have Epicureanism. There's nothing wrong, even if you have a Christian bent, to look at the Epicureans. They have great answers about suffering, about other things, about desires, minimizing desires. You have the Pyrrhonists, you have Neoplatonism also, just to look into antiquity, not to talk about the moderns. So to enlighten yourself about the issues of the first half of life. And think about us, the third halfers of lives and their kind of problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You want to respond briefly to Lydia, and then Carolina has a question for you.
I'm not sure I have anything to add to that, but all good points well taken. Thank you very much, Lydia.
Okay, thank you. Yes, indeed, Lydia. Carolina, who's going to be presenting this afternoon, has her hand up. Carolina, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
So, hi, I want to suggest a small idea for you. Thank you for your presentation, first of all. I would say from my experience, most of the clients don't need to know it's about this philosopher or this school of this kind of thinking and why it is like that. You have on your hand a really good tool to deal with clients, which is the critical thinking. They need to know how to think. they need to know how to be linked to practical life, to daily life. That's why your knowledge is like a huge quantity of water. And if you want to let the water go to another one, you should filter it and make it like going step by step, not the full water to put it on, because it can be disconvenient and it cannot help. So your knowledge, you should use it as filtered to let the client see, think, feel what he wants to reach with you when you are in consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina.
That makes a great deal of sense. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, you are going to get more advice. We have a room full of experience.
That's what I'm here for. That's great.
This is great. Okay, Carol, otherwise known as Chalista, has her hand up. Carol, please go ahead. Carol, are you there?
Yes, your talk was splendid. Thank you. First of all. Secondly, I wanted to just I have an observation about the Stoics and Buddhists with regard to the first half of life primarily, because many people, I taught a course that I designed in philosophy of aging, and oddly, there was a huge amount of interest in it amongst the students. And one thing to think about is that both the Stoics and the Buddhists are quite helpful, because first of all, and one thing that I'm personally interested in is grief counseling, you know, and the whole problem of grief and these issues of loss, you know, at any stage of life, I think are meaningfully addressed and actually very rigorously addressed by both the Stoics and the Buddhists, and especially the Stoics. I mean, Cicero, for example, has, you know, wrote on aging. Seneca wrote on mourning, et cetera, et cetera. I'll spare you. I won't bore you with all this. But I loved your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. Indeed, Cicero was canceled in a big way, you know. Fulvia, the wife of Antonio, had his head cut off, and she stuck a hat pin through his tongue, right? Because she was so disturbed by the. You know this. Alex, it occurs to me as Carol was speaking about her, you know, about her work on philosophy of aging. You know, life expectancies in the developed world have doubled in the last century. So a century ago, your talk would have been half as long because there was no second half of life.
This is true, yeah.
And now, you know, it's not gratuitous. You're going to have to add another module soon called the third half of life as we extend from 80 to 120. We're waiting for that third half of life, okay? We're going to really need some guidance at that point. You know, okay, so Shanti has her hand up. Shanti, who will also be presenting this afternoon. Please go ahead, Shanti, unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, Alex, because in any of those positions, I really didn't see where, you know, virtue epistemology fit in. And, you know, at any point in a person's life, they're concerned with their happiness. We have to go back to Plato and Aristotle that, you know, this is the major concern, and the way to get to it is through virtue. And in my talk later, I will talk about proper pride and self-respect as a measure of oneself, and how people mismeasure themselves, and that's a great source of unhappiness. And I think all throughout our lives we do that. But so that's the only thing I felt was missing, was in looking in the first half and the second half, the overriding concern is, how am I going to get happiness? And in all of those things, whether it's death, marriage, children, and then it gets down to, well, given my situation, what is going to be the highest good and what is going to make me feel, but what is going to bring me the greatest happiness, and critically thinking through those. And that's what I felt was missing, because for me, it's the central part of my work. And somehow I felt it was made obscure and to the side, not really brought out. And that was my only comment. But of course, the other things I appreciated learning from you. Thank you.
Thanks. No, that does make sense. Yes, that's, as you say, that's the sort of the central issue of happiness as that which is ultimately desirable, whether in first half of life or second half of life. Yes, that's a sort of a background which I didn't make explicit, and yes, perhaps should have done. I just trying to ventriloquize Jung a little bit. I would imagine that he might think in terms of different virtues which are more appropriate for the different concerns at different phases of life. But that's, yes, again, that's not something which is very explicit in his work either.
No, that's why I left Jungians, because I felt that virtue was not at all, virtue was not of a concern. It was individuation, and individuation isn't necessarily concerned with virtue. And maybe that's why in the United Kingdom and some places in the United States, Jung isn't really, of course he has many good ideas, but that's one of them that I found very lacking.
Yeah. Point well taken. Yes, thanks. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Shanti. That's a very interesting line. Gary has his hand up, and I wonder if we're going to hear more about models. I really identify with that because I did a degree in physics, and you're absolutely right, Gary. Physics, they just construct very elegant models at times, right? But they're models, and maybe everything's representational. So are you going to comment on Alex's model, or are you going to give us something else?
I'm going to give you something else. And I think, always hard for a philosopher, particularly who likes to teach, to do this, but I'll be as brief as possible. I think one of the things that is often needed from philosophy these days is, you might say, there's a kind of debunking side to philosophy, and by that I don't mean a kind of nasty, vicious approach that simply reduces everything to a kind of nihilism, although I have to admit to enjoying both Nietzsche and Nietzsche's attacks on nihilism. But there's a really interesting book by a Canadian philosopher and cognitive scientist called Evan Thompson. It came out in the last year, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's called Why I Am Not a Buddhist.
I've heard of that. I haven't read it. Yeah, Evan Thompson.
Yeah, it's a very kind and compassionate debunking of where Buddhism has got to. And Evan Thompson's background is, in fact, very, very deeply embedded in Buddhist practice, going back to the time when he was, I think, very young and part of an intentional community. So he has no desire whatsoever to tell people to shun Buddhism, but he's very concerned. And so he's able to bring practice together with a lot of work, I think highly credible work, at least as people in the field tell me, in embodied cognition. So, one of the things that, that I think is useful to offer people as an option, not because you necessarily want to go there with them right away, is a bit of a perspective on some of the limitations on some of the intellectual fads of our time. And Buddhism is, I think, certainly an intellectual fad, right? However great the merits of actually practiced Buddhism are. So.
Absolutely, yes. And in sort of contemporary Buddhist circles in Britain, I encountered as well this sort of feeling of being fed up with all the mindfulness talk, which Lou has already alluded to. I think is it Ron Purser who wrote a famous piece called McMindfulness?
I know the piece. I don't remember the author.
Yeah, which, again, articulated the same sort of thing quite nicely.
Yes, it was Ron Purser and David Loy.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Actually, one follow-up.
Rick is editing. Since you've just chimed in, Rick, let me promote. Rick is editing a book on. Well, why don't you tell us the title, Rick? I contributed a chapter myself, but this is right on topic. Go ahead.
the Rutledge Handbook on the Philosophy of Meditation. We have 27 authors, 29 authors, 27 chapters. Yeah. It should be out early next year, the latest.
And these are mostly philosophers, correct?
Yes.
So it
some
will
scientists, neuroscience, some long-term practitioners, some theologians, mostly philosophers.
Right, and hopefully this will shed light, or maybe darkness on the debate, but light. I think it should be great, Rick.
Thank you, Lou.
Just let me, you're more than welcome. So Gary and Alexander, if you're a non-Buddhist, if you become enough of a non-Buddhist, then Buddhists will simply say you're so non-Buddhist, you're Buddhist, because this is what happens. In some sense, everybody's a Buddhist, it's just that not everybody knows it. So, I mean, taking that Mahayanist tack, you cannot be a non-Buddhist, not for long. But to call it a fad, I mean, the hula hoop was a fad, excuse me. The hula hoop was a fad, okay? It came, it was big, it went. I don't see anybody hula hooping their way around anywhere in the developed world. And I don't know what's being done with all the excess hula hoops. But that's a fad, Buddhism has been around for 2,500 years, and it's continually metamorphosing, but it also stays the same at its core. And I think in that sense, it's a little bit more than a fad, okay? I just think Buddhism and hula hoops are not quite the same.
Right. Well, just to explain what I meant, and you may still disagree with this, I don't think Buddhism itself is a fad, but I think there's been a kind of weirdly culturally appropriated version of Buddhism that's become a kind of fad. And I think in many ways, Thompson's book is very good for distinguishing between the two and actually teasing out some of the historical roots, even within Eastern Buddhism, as a kind of response to Western colonialism. There's this kind of Buddhist apologetic that develops that itself and contains some distortions of Buddhism, and Thompson's point, and he may have gone too far with this, is that it's actually very hard to tap into, what someone might call a kind of, essential Buddhism, or at least, let's just say, to find a fairly healthy, nourishing branch of the very thick and well-developed Buddhist tree, And so I would defend that, but I certainly wouldn't attack the tree or the roots or question the possibility you might have healthy branches somewhere that Thompson hasn't found. But I related to this, I had one small further point, something that's really caught my interest in the last few months, which is that with the fellow named Stephen Hassan wrote a book on the cult of Trump, and digging into Hassan himself. I think another aspect of possibly useful philosophical practice is just to actually help develop cognitive habits, critical epistemic habits in people that are cult resistant. And so, for me, who was for a few years a Buddhist meditation practitioner, and I stepped aside because I found some of it was actually harmful, it was very useful to actually read what Stephen had to say about cults. Because I think, in fact, it's possible, even with a very critical frame of mind, to be taught to turn off that critical frame of mind as a necessary part of practice, and then to move into a practice that's in the way of that. And I don't think that's inherent in Buddhism that it does that. But I do think that, that if you want to say the culturally appropriated, commercialized version that we have in North America, does that. And I think actually philosophical practice has a great deal to offer, in response to that, help people find a healthy version of things.
Right. May I just say to you that I'm not speaking for Alexander, but I see him nodding. Madison Avenue, or it used to be Madison Avenue, that did this thing. It took important cultural artifacts, and then it just commercialized them in the most gross and trivial ways. I think now it's Amazon and Silicon Valley or something, but it used to be Madison Avenue. As a child of the 60s, Gary, and you look pretty much like you may have come of age around then, maybe a little later, but we grew up, we had psychedelics, we saw God, and if God exists, we saw God. But you know what Madison Avenue turned that into? They turned that into avocado green kitchen appliances.
Right.
They took LSD and they made floral bed sheets out of it.
Yeah.
So what do you want from them? This is what they do.
Right.
This is their shtick. Don't take it too seriously. The definitive book on cults and how to identify and avoid them is Eric Hoffer, The True Believer. Right. That is really, I think, an illuminating work. We have time for a couple more questions, and it's very rich. These contributions are wonderful. So, did Dion have her hand up? Dion, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to ask a question? I see Andre's hand up. So, if Dion, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Alex, I didn't want to get Jungian about it, but it's a very interesting concept between the first and second half of life. And so often you call to these dialogue facilitation sessions, which we've been doing for many years now, but it often comes after some monumental crisis. In the organization I'm talking about now. So I was just wondering with Alex, because Jungian psychoanalysis and some philosophers speak about this a lot as well, this kind of darkness that you have to go into prior to entering the second half of life questioning that is required to move on from the dark place. And I was just wondering, in terms of practice, how would he negotiate that, or if that was the reason for the for the client coming in the first place, how would that speak to his ideas about this?
Thanks. Yeah, well, I think as far as my knowledge of Jung goes, you're right that in Jung and in the Jungian world, there is this often the sense that you're kind of initiated into the whole second half of life and its difficulties and traumas by a particular acute dark experience. Jung himself went through some sort of midlife, I think he used the word breakdown, and had kind of visionary experiences and all kinds of things. As far as your question goes about how one would respond to this in the clinical setting, I'm afraid I am not the person to ask, lacking the experience to speak to that. But I would assume, at least as far as I'm thinking about the classification, I would assume that the kind of extreme experiences of breakdown and so on that Jung describes are at one end of a spectrum. Many of us will not be incapacitated by uncontrollable visions of the world on fire and so on, as Jung was, but still in our smaller ways we'll grapple with second half of life meaning questions, not only in the second half of life but throughout our adult lives, I'm sure. But yeah, as I say, as far as the clinical side goes, I would be speculating, so I would have to defer to my more experienced colleagues on that one.
Okay, we'll take two more questions. Alex, I had a client once who was a clinical psychologist, an American clinical psychologist, and her problem was that she had been trained by American Jungians, and then she went to Switzerland and went to the original Jung school, and they abused her in the most vulgar ways because they wanted to disabuse her of her American Jungian training, claiming that, of course, they were the authentic cult, and she had been trained by the ersatz cult. So they put her through a horrifying process that was so psychologically damaging, she sought philosophical counseling for it. And you don't need to know anything about Jung to understand what cults do to people, regardless of what the cult is called.
I believe there was, I'm not going to be able to remember the details, but I believe there was at least one book on the Jung cult and taking very much that line on it. Yeah, so yes,
Right.
that
And it's
sense
good
that
for
runs through.
us to read some books on deprogramming. In general, there are lots of examples out there of various ways of deprogramming people. And I think it's interesting for us because we may encounter it in our work. Bala had his Bala. You unmuted yourself. Would you like to make a comment or question? Bala, please go ahead.
No, Lou, basically I don't have any comments to make.
Okay, thank you, Bala, for being here. We have two more quick ones. John Tambernino, who's presenting this afternoon and will be touching on topics already raised. John, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Good talk, good discussion. I agree. I wouldn't myself get too fixated on this dichotomy. It seems it could get in the way as much as it could help. But one thing I would just like to offer as another stage of life that philosophical counseling, I think, has a great deal to offer, and that is end of life issues. I don't know the extent to which people have really focused on that. That's what I intend to focus on eventually as my specialty. Stoicism, of course, very relevant. Epicureanism, relevant. I've spent a fair amount of time in hospice settings in the past few years as loved ones have been dying, and I've been observing what is offered is typically offered by clergy who offer pastoral counseling, and often kind of a rote form of saying a prayer that's appropriate for whatever the faith is of the person who's dying and their family. But I would just offer that, and it could be some of you are doing a great deal in that area that I'm not aware of, but that's an area where I think philosophical counseling really has something to contribute in terms of just working with people to make sense of their lives at the end. And that kind of retrospective reflection and developing a narrative that makes sense to them such that they can die at peace and understand how they're understanding death as it's approaching. So I just want to express that as an interest.
Yeah, that certainly makes it. I believe Irving Yalom has written a fair bit about that, hasn't he?
Well, Yalom, I'm going to ask Vaughna to chime in because she has done work in this area. Yalom, you need to know, shifted in his 80s from long-term psychotherapy to short-term work because he was in his 80s and he felt an ethical responsibility not to take on long-term clients, long-term for him being 6 or 8 years, very expensive Yalomian treatment. So what did Yalom pick up as a tool? Stoicism. And because he could work short term with clients, and he switched over. In the end, he became a philosophical counselor. Staring at the Sun. Read his book. It's all about this. Vaughna, please, and then we'll ask Andre to comment, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, Vaughna, you've done work with people, cancer survivors and others. What is your feedback?
Well, I wasn't going to comment so much on end of life issues, although I agree with you. That's a very interesting area. What I wanted to comment on was the fact that I thought both of these wonderful presentations that we've had this morning are so applicable to a variety of different practical contexts. I work predominantly with groups nowadays, and I'm finding that I am asked to do more and more groups where there is some specific goal in mind for the group as a whole. For example, working in prison work, you have the goal of reducing recidivism in some degree. If you're working with cancer patients, it's quality of life issues. Lately, I'm always handed impossible situations, and I was asked to talk to some union people about vaccination. And it's with the goal, of course, of getting more people who are resistive to getting vaccinated to agree to be vaccinated. And it occurs to me that both of your presentations this morning are very applicable to these kinds of situations. I think, Alex, that in achieving any of these goals, you need to deal with both first and second life concerns. You find very many substance abuse people who want to focus simply on, okay, I'm not going to relapse anymore. But they really need to take up all these second order issues or second life issues. Lydia, what you had to say about illusions are so relevant. Trying to establish some kind of commonality with people in your groups about the illusions that we may hold, and trying to identify what their illusions are that prevent them from achieving either avoiding a relapse, avoiding recidivism, or dying because they refuse to get vaccines. So these are very, very practical papers that you've given, but I think examining illusion and examining first and second stage life issues are essential to any kind of program work. So thank you very much for your insights on that.
Well, thank you. That's a really nice, clear answer to that question that I ended up on at the end of my presentation. So yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, yes, indeed. Thank you, Vona. And now, before lunch, we'll give Andre the last word again. Andre from Brazil, please make your question or comment to Alex.
That was lovely, Alex. Thank you. The question that I have is whether do you see the pursuit of human flourishing as playing any role in the scheme which you presented, and if you do, which role exactly?
Okay, thanks, Andre. Good to see you. And yeah, good question. I think, in fact, my answer to that would be very similar to my answer to the question about virtue and the place of virtue in all of this. Taking a further step back, taking a step back from the first half of life versus second half of life dichotomy, I guess one could say that the overall goal is human flourishing. That is going to some extent, it's going to have different forms, but also human flourishing is going to encounter different obstacles at different phases of life. I think that would be the way that the Jungians would talk about this division. One's flourishing is going to encounter different obstacles at different moments in one's life, some sort of practical first half of life, more directly problem-solving issues, and others more concerned with meaning and the role of meaning in a flourishing human life. Therefore, different kinds of philosophical approaches, strategies, practices, so on, might be more appropriate in pursuing the goal of a flourishing life at different moments. Yes, I think that's the way that I would respond to that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, once again for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation, and all of you for your comments and questions. We're going to break for lunch. Now it's almost an hour. We're doing well on time. We will come back at 1. So you have 50 minutes, 50 minutes. So please enjoy yourselves. Have a nice lunch. Do whatever you do at this time of day, wherever you are in the world. And we will reconvene in 49 minutes. Okay, 1 o'clock sharp New York time. And we will have presentations by Carolina and by John. And don't forget Shanti, who will close out the program today, and then followed by our happy hour, okay? So enjoy your lunch, everyone, and I will see you back here at 1 o'clock.